Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for everyone in attendance. This is actually one of one of the first times I've tried to present a book that I've recently finished that's about to be published with Routledge, and it's kind of I had much bigger ambitions for the book, uh, but when it actually came time to write it. What I found most useful was actually consolidating a lot of the theory that I'd been using to help to orient myself to the history of education and the history of universities in particular. So this is kind of just the culmination of that work, a lot of which I did during my uh, doctoral research as well as my postdoctoral research, where I was involved in a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship, and the purpose of that fellowship was to combine uh, the sociology of Norbert Elias with the history of universities. So that was there's another book I finished during that process that some of you might be familiar with called Norbert Elias and the Sociology of Education, and I assume that's also why I was invited. But so this is kind of a summary of the work I've been up to, and it's also a sort of a jumping off point, I hope, for new lines of research. So if I can work out how to share my screen, I'll do that now. So this is essentially a processual analysis, and I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by processual. Obviously, those of you who are familiar with Norbert Elias know that the figurational tradition has the processual approach. And then I also use Andrew Abbott's more recent process sociology to kind of try and combine these two, as well as combined with a few others who I'll explain in a minute. But essentially, the premise of the book, The University of Revolution, and why that's the title, I was originally going to call it the academization process, a bit like the civilizing process. But then I realized that academization is a bit confusing because in Britain, that means transferring from a state school to a kind of quasi private charter type of school. I don't know if you have the same in Ireland, but I found a lot of folks were turning up to my talks and thinking that they were going to learn about how Michael Gove ruined primary schools, and I was there to tell them about the long history of universities. So I realized what I was really doing was more or less looking at uh, the dual revolution, or what sociologists used to call the dual revolution of industrial revolution and democratic revolution, which folks like Giddens, Eric Hobsbawm, a bunch of folks have described this dual revolution as the industrial and democratic revolutions and how those led to modernity. And I was essentially trying to say, well, there was actually an equally important university revolution that was going on alongside these, and that furthermore, that wasn't an accident, that actually the rise of universities resolved a number of contradictions that were going on during the industrial and democratic revolutions. And ultimately, these were also not particularly revolutionary. All three of these actually took several hundred years to occur. So really, you could call them the industrialization process, democratization process, and academization process. So this kind of gets me into what I mean by the processual sociology. So this is just a kind of a schema of some of the theoretical influences I have going on. So you can see here, there's Norbert Elias, and I'm essentially, what I'm doing in this more general theory is trying to resolve the structure agency problem through more or less completely temporalizing both structure and agency. So everything is just temporal variations of different analytic scales. And so you have different structures may last for different lengths of time, but they're ultimately processes, not things. So again, this Norbert Elias distinguished in the court society. He talked about natural history, sociological history, individual history. And so these are just essentially durations. So since the Big Bang, natural historical processes have been more or less ongoing, and that's what leads to certain sort of material reality, and also natural sciences, why it's a bit easier to do them than social sciences. Hoping there's no natural scientists in the room, but then you have sociological history and then individual history, which is more or less the perspective we have as individuals. Now, what I've done with that is linked that to more recent multidimensional theories of power, especially that of Isaac Reed, who's developed, initially he broke down Michael Mann's ideological power into three dimensions: relational, communicative, and performative. He's since added the material, which kind of completes the diagram, which is helpful. But if you just focus on relational and communicative systems, so communicative, this would be anything from Foucault to any analysis of discourses, epistemes, cultural sociology. And I actually tend to use Luhmann the most in this, because Luhmann's talking about societies are communicative, or are communication, not human beings. And that's helpful for distinguishing from human action. Relational structures are things like Bourdieu's fields, Michael Mann's sources of social power. You've also got, capital, Marx, and so forth. And we're relatively familiar with those in sociology as well. But again, keeping with Norbert Elias, I think that sociology has the most to contribute in terms of analyzing these long-term sociological processes. And while there's an influence of social psychology and all the rest of it, I actually think there's something sensible about having psychological or philosophical focus on individual level analysis. That said, at the individual level of history or events, you do have this performative dimension of power happening, where all of these relational structures, these communicative structures, have to be performed over and over again. That's what gives the social structures durability and duration. So it's also a space where you could create new power. So Reed draws on Arendt and others to say, well, when Hindenburg declares the Republic of Germany, that makes the German Republic into existence. That didn't exist, and then the act of saying it exists in a particular way with a particular format, that makes it exist. Similarly, you could look at other performances of power, like the State of the Union address in the United States, where there's a whole staged kind of performance, or the Queen's speech in England. But ultimately, it doesn't really do much in terms of power. It doesn't change anything. If anything, it just reinforces the status quo. But nonetheless, it is a performance. It's just a conservative performance. So anyway, all of these are kind of what I'm interpreting together as coming together in events, which may be individual kind of like actions and conjunctures, in particular historical moments. And if you're a historian, you could choose to look at all of the contingency and particularity of those events. Or if you look at them from a longer term point of view, these are processes. And so there's not particularly any major difference between processes and events from a metaphysical point of view. It's really just a kind of an analytic scale question. So if that sounds really general, that's just where I'm coming from, and it might be of interest to people, but that's kind of the way I went about studying these universities in that way. So here now we're looking at a very particular process. So you could sort of think of this as a middle range analysis of where do universities come from. At some point, they didn't exist. in the modern way that we understand them. And then over the course of especially the 19th century, again, in parallel to the industrial and democratic revolutions, all of a sudden you have this two-phase process. The first, you have a transition from what is essentially a medieval institution. Universities, it's organized around theology and training of the clergy, secondarily law, and then medicine, although medicine also has kind of different medical schools and things as well at the start of the 19th century. But the process that I'm interested in is happening in several different national contexts. You have France, Germany, America, Britain, and others as well. Um, and I'm more or less drawing on a framework for understanding this that I otherwise criticize, which is the modernization theory represented by people like Edward Shills, Joseph Ben David, Parsons, and so on. I otherwise disagree with a lot of what they say, but Ben David, an Israeli sociologist, had an analysis of centers of learning. And it's essentially almost like an institutional isomorphism analysis where at some point France was at the center of the higher education system, and then everyone tried to copy France. And then Germany moved to the center, and then America copied Germany, and so on. Britain's an interesting case because it's almost always a secondary center. So Britain's one of the only places that doesn't really follow completely the core structure that's emerging, especially in Germany and America. That's really where, in the period of interest I'm interested in, initially Germany and then America are really the center of these processes. And that's not because I prefer those countries or anything. It's just that those were the center of where everybody was looking for the role models of how to organize their higher education systems. So the medieval to modern transition from the kind of what would have been these clergy or medieval institutions into modern, initially elite institutions for a range of different professions rather than just the clergy. Most of the book is identified with this process. And I spend a lot of time essentially suggesting that rather than the main cause that is identified by folks like the modernization theorists, where they say science and technology are the main drivers of this process, I say that actually that's actually more of a 20th century post-war American ideology that they project backwards and say that's what was going on in Germany, and it actually just wasn't the case. And that science and technology were significant. I'm not saying it wasn't important at all, but it was alongside these other factors, as well as more I haven't listed here. But the five I think are most important are the decline of aristocracies and the rise of the middle classes, the displacement of religion as the center of the university and the curriculum, imperial politics, and the changing role of women and children alongside science and technology. So what I can do now is kind of just briefly go through some of these causes to sort of say what I think was going on here. So again, science and technology were significant. They weren't completely incidental, especially as you get towards the later periods of the end of the first phase, and then especially in the second phase, science and technology becomes really significant to an extent in terms of genuine laboratory, chemical development, presenting resources. One of the reasons it becomes so significant in the post-war period is because of Cold War investment in nuclear weapons and Air Force and related computing and so on. So really, that side of the story comes into its own much more in the post 1945 era, and again that gets projected backwards into the 19th century, and everyone sort of says, well, Darwin was really important, and you have people like Ernst Haeckel making his drawings, and so on. But from what I could see, the science and technology was not really a major motivating factor, other than as an ideology for an emerging class of professionals, and in particular, social scientists were far more significant than natural scientists. In my, from what I've seen in secondary literature, as well as a lot of the archival research, you have social scientists saying that what they're doing is scientific, and they might reference, some kind of new empirical science going on, but really their main interest is social scientific management, especially of emerging social problems, especially those that emerge from the Industrial Revolution, things like pollution, environmental waste, public health concerns, and so on. So again, I'm not saying it's insignificant, but it is only just one of five. And so to my mind, actually the major driver and the way that it's linked to the democratic and industrial revolutions is due to the class conflict that's going on in the 19th century, which I also do not think is immediately the conflict between capital and uh, proletariat, which is the classic Marxist model that does become more important towards the end of the century. But initially, the main influence on what's happening in education is the middle class trying to break into aristocratic positions of power. And it's really almost entirely framed in terms of the middle class's resentment and critique of the lack of utility of the aristocracy and the aristocracy's inherited privileges. So it basically, you have a lot of industrialists and middle class folks saying that what the aristocrats do is totally counterproductive and a waste, things like they don't pay taxes and so forth, and that they that we need to put the aristocracy to work essentially. And then there's a pushback, either in the form of conservatism or reactionary, uh, just full on old regime needs to come back, which you get in the Restoration and the the period in between the end of French Revolution and 1848, the Holy Alliance and so forth. And what emerges from that is really neither win, but you get this kind of new hybrid class, which is the new class of academics, professionals, civil servants, colonial administrators. Some of these are scientists, natural scientists, but the overwhelming majority are people like lawyers, financiers, um, medical doctors, all of the folks that you see rising to prominence in the 19th century. And again, the major criticism throughout is this kind of, the middle class is not in power and they're trying to get into power, and they're constantly criticizing the lack of utility, and utilitarianism, and is kind of the ideology, and liberalism. And as they try to get into universities, which are otherwise the stronghold of the old regime, it's not actually the aristocrats themselves, the landowners and so forth, that they confront. They're actually confronting the clergy, because it's still this medieval institution. And so this is where the next phase of, or the next significant thing that's going on, is essentially a jurisdictional dispute between the clergy and those promoting a classical curriculum, a classical humanist curriculum rooted in a kind of holistic sort of Renaissance, but mixed with a kind of classicism and philosophical, some mathematics in a kind of classical philosophical sense, ultimately about logic. And then you have this new criticism by the emerging liberal class, folks like utilitarianism. And this really kicks off, the first set of criticisms are in places like University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and those most linked to the Scottish Enlightenment, and they have a different established church, which is an influence. Then you have the emergence of the University of London, in Britain. And then finally, you get in the second half of the century, folks like Henry Sidgwick at Cambridge and others in Oxford making the kind of utilitarian criticism of classical education, and you start to get more science, more economics, more useful degrees. And the significance of this is not just that they displace the classical curriculum, it's that they turn the core discipline of theology into a specialized, it's like a subfield amongst a range of other subfields. So they introduced modern language and literature and all of these new fields that then you just get this kind of proliferation of specialized disciplines and a bifurcation of knowledge, so where everyone's in a different discipline and there is no core set of knowledge anymore. And that's another significant outcome of this. So the other thing that's going on across the 19th century that hasn't historically gotten enough attention outside of places like post-colonial sociology and history is the role of imperialism. And in general, those analyses that are emerging, things like the decolonizing the curriculum point of view, very rightly draw attention to the really horrid ways in which education was used as a kind of part of the civilizing process in terms of the civilizing mission of the idea that these Western countries were giving education, and then eventually the ignorant natives would eventually they would learn how to self-govern themselves. And wasn't it a gift that these Western powers were educating everyone and teaching them to read and write? And that's obviously really important, but actually in my analysis, the more significant thing that's going on is actually the intra-imperial competition, because once you establish that these aren't really particularly nation states, they're actually empire states, and they're in conflict one another, not just around the world, but also within Europe. You have things like France, imperial conquest of Germany is one of the major drivers for the German reform of universities. And then it's the fear of Germany rising and uniting and linking up with the partitions they've gotten from Poland, and the ways in which they've consolidated the German states through unification. They defeat France and annex Alsace-Lorraine and build a university right on top of the walls that they built, that Louis XIV had built in Strasbourg. So the German represents themselves as, on the one hand, being very efficient and rational military, using their railroads and so forth for this new Clausewitzian military campaigns. And then their university education and the way they've organized universities, especially at the University of Berlin, but ultimately this kind of philosophical culture, the way that Germany represented themselves, is that was the source of their power. Everyone started to copy this in the second half of the 19th century. Japan is copying this. Chile and the South American states are copying this. America essentially send visitors over. They were going to visit France, but then when Germany wins in 1871, they send all of their visiting scholars to Strasbourg and Berlin to find out what's the German model. And they bring all of that back as graduate schools at Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Columbia University, Harvard, and so on. And if you look at most of what the United States is doing in the 19th century, they're trying to copy Germany. They're having meetings at the White House with German ambassadors to try to, they talk about colonizing Latin America together, using higher education as the means to do this. So all of this history gets essentially written out, especially by the time you get to the post-war period. You have folks like Schills and Ben David and so forth. They essentially write out this kind of pro-Germanic, Teutonic story that's not just in America, it's in Britain and elsewhere. As far as I know, Ireland as well is copying these models as well. Okay, last cause that doesn't really come up until you bring it back into the story is the changing role of women and children during the 19th century. So children, especially at the beginning of the century, are not particularly there's not a huge movement to bring them into education. There's some utopian socialists interest in educating everyone in places like New Lanark, Robert Owens. But in general, children are either working on farms still, or if they're in industrial cities, they're getting work as soon as they can. Most of the education is for public school and grammar school. Boys, especially girls, have a different set of training in essentially fine arts and humanities. But it's tied up with this middle class idea of work and utility, and they start to define their own children's existence as childhood is a period of time when you don't work and you play, and then you become an adult, and then you go to work, and then your time is divided between work and play or whatever, leisure time and work time. And then you start to get all of this philanthropic effort to then prevent children from working and get them into schools. And then you have all of these child poverty rules, the public health initiatives, and a lot of these things are driven actually by middle class women and their charitable activities. And I really take a long look at the history of suffrage in Britain, because a lot of folks in America and other places didn't really quite get this when I started to understand Britain is universal suffrage for men didn't really happen until well into the 20th century. And so women used to access power in the same way men would access power, which is through lobbying MPs, lobbying local gentry and lords, forming associations. And so they weren't necessarily disenfranchised at the beginning of the 19th century in the same way they are towards the middle of the century as suffrage for men starts to expand. And that sort of creates this problem for women where they all of a sudden want the right to vote. And they really start to get offended when the right to vote for men gets extended even to working class people, to folks from other races that they don't appreciate. There's a sign of women, convicts and lunatics and so forth get the right to vote. And they point out that women can get education, and that education, higher education in particular, would enable them to not just vote, but also access professions that they've been excluded from, things like medicine, things like all these professions. And one of the major tensions is whether women are able to do mathematics, and that gets demonstrated through people like Emily Davies at Girton, that's not true, that women are not biologically inferior, and so on. And through this process, it's not just women accessing higher education, but they actually set a lot of the terms and the ethics of what higher education is for. And in particular, how you widen access, that there's this big debate about whether you change the standards to accommodate women. I call this the Girton-Newnham debate. At Girton, Emily Davies says, no change to standards. Women can do anything that men can do, and in fact, we can do it better. And they actually get offended if the suggestion is made that you might need to change exams or something to accommodate women. On the other hand, you have Newnham, which is dealing with, it's coming from a very different place. Henry Sidgwick, the utilitarian, is involved in establishing it. You have the Council for Women's Education in north of England, people like Anne Clough up in Liverpool and so on. They actually set up the first working men's education, public lectures, which leads to university settlements and so forth. And their attitude is essentially we need to get women into higher education and adapt the curriculum to encourage more women to participate, and then the curriculum can shift to accommodate the women and so on. And in fact, kind of both of those things happen together, but it's nonetheless an interesting debate to look at. Finally, you have people like George Eliot is making arguments about how the middle classes interventions and kind of a push into culture and higher education is causing what she calls the debasing of the moral currency. It's sort of threatening to throw the baby out with the bathwater by this whole kind of like anti-aristocratic, anti-elitism actually has the conditions of sort of evaporating all culture entirely and replacing it with a kind of mechanical, soulless culture. And you have the same arguments being made by Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin. In Germany, you have Nietzsche making similar arguments, and so on. In the United States, you have people like Thorstein Veblen making the same arguments, and it's essentially an anti-capitalist, anti-pecuniary position. And it's just very significant that the number of women that were involved in articulating this, I call it a kind of civic ideal that gets institutionalized in things like the Red Bricks in Britain, University of Bristol, Victoria University, and so on. In Ireland, actually, UCD, John Henry Newman is very early in presenting this kind of an argument, and so on. So all of this then gets kind of baked in by the time you end the first phase of the process. So you could kind of, they blend into one another, but sort of turn of the 20th century and into the 1920s and 30s, you then start to see this new phase, the phase two, where you essentially have this structure that's now set up, goes from an elite system, which is essentially controlling access to professions. That's what it's set up to do. It's managing, in the context of democratization, in the context of this kind of rapidly changing culture, the decision, it's almost like a settlement between the middle classes and the aristocracy is sort of, okay, well, through universities, we can say, so long as you get admitted to university, then you can have access to the professions. And all sorts of efforts are made through the Carnegie Foundation and so on to distinguish what they call sham universities from official universities and so on. And they sort of consolidate this. There's a huge racial dimension, and most of this is actually organized around anti-Semitism. And the major concern, especially in Germany and America, are to keep Jewish students out because they want to keep them out of the professions, because they think that the Jewish population is ruining politics in places like New York City, Chicago. Actually, in Germany, Austria, Vienna is like a major place of this. It's not really a huge difference between Austria and Germany at this point. Yeah, so they kind of set this system up, and then through the course of the wars, especially once you have the GI Bill, and then you have what's called the second GI Bill, where they introduce women and minorities into higher education, especially in the US. And that's interestingly when they introduce privatized student loans into the system. It's sort of the men get it for free, and then when it's time to let the women and minorities in, they all of a sudden everyone has to pay for themselves, pay for their own human capital. And essentially this it's just kind of expands, and in fact all of these contradictions proliferate in the second phase. And that's kind of where we're at now, where originally you might see something like universities are a social mobility engine where someone from, let's say, a working class background could go to university, they gain access to the professions, and that's a kind of an upwardly mobile trajectory. By the time you're in the 1970s, 80s, especially by the time you're now, that relationship between education and eventual social position is more or less gone, because you've not increased the number of professions, you've not increased the structural holes that folks are going into, you've just increased the number of applicants and qualified graduates now competing. And so the end result of this is not equality, it's actually massively increased precarity for everyone, both the people in with higher education as well as the 50% of the population who don't go to university. They're in an even worse position. So ultimately, that's kind of where I'm at now, and what I'm hoping that the analysis can explain in a way that we haven't really been able to thus far is a few things I can point to, and maybe we could talk more about these in discussion. Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be a click. First is you have the culture wars that are going on right now, and there needs to be a recognition, first and foremost, that inequality is increasingly structured around higher education and credentials. It's not, we really have to abandon the idea that university education helps in any way with equality. They essentially are separating and bifurcating the population into two different economic, political, cultural groups, one of which concentrates themselves in cities, university towns, and votes for center-left and perhaps left-wing parties, perhaps center-right parties. And then you have everyone else who the main characteristics of this is regional especially, are older populations, ethnically homogenous, and without higher education. And that's a very long-term process where essentially beginning in the 1960s, young people who were going to higher education started to leave rural and provincial places and move to the cities, and very few have ever come back. And so that's why you have these kind of like multi-ethnic, credentialed, professional cities, lots of inequalities and dynamics in those cities, but it's why you have a very homogenous population that are essentially increasingly having issues of social care, no jobs, very little hope for the future. And they've also experienced rapid changes in their society, and especially in culture, like the media does not particularly represent their it's relatively unrecognizable for a lot of them. And so they blame the universities and the media and the cultural elites and all the rest of it, and that increasingly plays itself out in politics. And that's not just in America, it's also in Britain, it's in France, it's in Brazil. It's a globalization issue that has these local manifestations. And again, I've mentioned these regional inequalities that this leads to. The only way out of this would be something like a major geographic Keynesianism, where you really radically overhaul the distribution of essentially cultural capital, which is embodied in individuals. So you essentially need to rebalance the migration patterns of the past 50 years, or just continue to have Trump voters until that population, I suppose, it's deceased. I don't know. And then lastly, this is a more abstract idea, but there's an increasing sense in which we have more and more concerns over second order observation, form, scientific metrics, GDP, and kind of indicators of things rather than investment in those things. And that's because of the way the professional classes have been trained because of that longer term process. And so you essentially have these new class of professionals who refuse to acknowledge that they're elites, in part because it's difficult to say 50% of the population is an elite anymore. But let's say this population is going into every organization and organizing it in their image and essentially giving PowerPoints to one another. That's more or less what modernity now consists of, is a lot of political scientists managing politics badly, a lot of economists managing the economy badly. Similarly, you can more or less track this in the evolution of higher education, you have a lot of business graduates now managing universities badly. So that's kind of where I'm at. Not a very cheerful thing, but maybe we can look towards the future, because I do feel like the second phase is at the end of the line, and we do need to think of something else. So I'll stop there and kind of conclude. So thank you very much for everything. Thanks.